I look back now and my life feels less like a story and more like a responsibility I never walked away from. I was never a rich man, no big house, no powerful name. I had only two things that mattered: responsibility. And my son, the day he was born, I was sitting on a hard bench outside the hospital, holding a small bag with everything I owned. When the doctor came out and said, "Congratulations, it's a boy," I felt something lock into place inside me. In that moment, I made a promise. I didn't say it out loud, but I felt it clearly. I will never let this child feel what I felt growing up. I didn't know then that promises like that don't expire. They collect interest. My job was ordinary: early mornings, late nights, long days where my body was tired but my mind refused to rest. People used to ask me, "What about your own life?" I would smile and say, "There's time for that later." The truth was, I spent my time on him. School fees, books, uniforms, doctor visits, tuition classes when he struggled. I skipped meals sometimes. I delayed my own needs often, but I never felt cheated. When he brought home his first trophy, I held it like it was mine. When he spoke his first full sentence in English, even with broken grammar, I felt proud. When he talked about dreams bigger than my income, I didn't stop him. People warned me. They said I was doing too much. They said children become ungrateful when life is made easy. I didn't listen. I told myself I was giving him what I never had. Time passed. He grew smarter, more confident. College came, then a job in another city. And slowly, without any argument, I became background noise. At first, we spoke every day, then every few days, then once a week. Eventually, I learned to wait. When I called, he was busy: meetings, deadlines, life. I understood. Or at least I convinced myself I did. When he got married, I felt relief. I told myself my responsibility was complete. He was settled, independent. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in years. But something changed after that. His world became smaller, and in that smaller world, I barely fit. I tried to stay cheerful. I tried not to complain. I didn't want to sound needy. One day, during a casual phone call, I laughed and said, "Looks like you'll be the one taking care of me when I get old." There was silence, not anger, not laughter, just silence. Then he said, "Dad, don't joke like that." I felt something shift, but I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking. A few days later, a message arrived. No shouting, no insults, no emotion, just one line. "Don't expect me to take care of you in old age." I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. I didn't cry, I didn't reply. What I felt wasn't anger, it was something heavier. A quiet realization that maybe love, when given blindly, teaches the wrong lesson. That night, I sat alone in the same house I had worked my whole life to build. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What if being a good father isn't only about giving, but also about teaching responsibility? What happened next was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It was deliberate. And it started with a decision I made in complete silence. After that message, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew that whatever I said next would decide the rest of my life. For years, I had taught myself to explain his behavior. I told myself he was busy. I told myself this was normal. I told myself children grow distant and parents adjust. That message took all my excuses and burned them in one sentence. Still, I didn't confront him. I woke up the next morning like nothing had happened, made my tea, read the news, sat in the same chair I had sat in for years. But something inside me had changed. For the first time, I stopped asking, "What did I do wrong?" and started asking, "What did I teach him?" I replayed moments I had ignored, the way I always solved his problems for him, the way I never let him feel consequences, the way I stepped in every time life became uncomfortable for him. I had mistaken protection for parenting. Days passed. He didn't call. I didn't either. That silence felt strange at first. like holding your breath underwater, waiting for pain. But then something unexpected happened. I started noticing myself again, my body, my habits, my money, my time, things I had ignored for decades. I realized how much of my life had been planned around someone else's comfort. I checked my bank account, not with fear, with clarity. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't helpless either, and that scared me more than poverty ever had. Because it meant I had options. A week later, he finally called. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Dad, everything okay? You didn't reply." I paused before answering. "Yes," I said, "I'm fine." That confused him. He expected anger, guilt, a lecture. Instead, he got calm. We spoke about normal things, work, weather, nothing important. Before hanging up, he said, "You didn't take my message seriously, right?" I smiled. "No," I said. "I did," and then I ended the call. That was the moment I stopped chasing reassurance. Because when someone tells you who they are, believe them. I didn't tell anyone what he had written, not friends, not relatives. This wasn't about shame. This was about strategy. I began reorganizing my life quietly. No announcements, no emotional speeches, just decisions. I updated documents I hadn't looked at in years. I read things I had postponed. I asked questions I had been afraid to ask. And with every step, I felt something returning. Control, not over him, over myself. Weeks later, he visited. He walked into the house like he always had, comfortable, confident. He looked around and said, "You should really think about the future." I nodded. "I am," I said. He smiled, thinking we meant the same thing. We didn't. Because while he believed the conversation was over, I had just begun writing a new chapter. One where love still existed, but entitlement did not. And the truth he would soon face was going to hurt far more than the message he had sent me. He thought my silence meant weakness. That's a mistake many people make when someone stops arguing. They assume the fight is over. What they don't realize is that silence is often where decisions are made. After his visit, I didn't confront him. I didn't question him. I didn't ask for explanations. Instead, I started watching. The way he spoke to me, the way he assumed things. The way he talked about his future as if mine no longer existed in it. He wasn't cruel. That would have been easier to process. He was indifferent, and indifference cuts deeper than anger ever could. One afternoon, he casually mentioned buying a bigger house, better neighborhood, better schools for his future children. He spoke with confidence. Then he said something that stayed with me. "You should think about downsizing. Old people don't need much." Old people, not his father, not the man who raised him, just old people. I nodded again. I had become very good at nodding. That night, I opened files I hadn't touched in years, insurance papers, savings accounts, property documents. I didn't rush. I read every line carefully, like someone reading instructions for a life they were finally taking seriously. I realized something important. For years, I had planned my future assuming my son would be part of it. That assumption had shaped every decision I made. Now that assumption was gone, and without it, my options expanded. I met with people quietly. Asked questions calmly, not emotional questions, practical ones. What happens if I live longer than expected? What happens if I need care? What happens if I don't want to depend on anyone? No one judged me. No one questioned my motives. They simply answered, and every answer felt like a door opening. Meanwhile, my son grew more comfortable. He stopped checking in as often. He assumed things were settled. That assumption gave me space. Space to think. Space to plan. Space to stop being reactive. One evening, he called again. This time, his tone was different. "Dad, I was thinking you should probably update your will." I smiled. "I already did," I said. There was a pause. He hadn't expected that. "Oh, okay," he said. "That's good." I could hear relief in his voice, relief that things were handled, that responsibility was off his plate. What he didn't know was this. I hadn't updated my will the way he imagined. I had rewritten my priorities. and that would soon become impossible for him to ignore, because the hardest lesson for a child who feels entitled is discovering that love does not mean obligation, and independence does not mean immunity. The moment of realization was coming, not with shouting, not with drama, but with consequences. And when they arrived, he would finally understand what his message had set in motion. I didn't change my behavior after that. That was important. If I had suddenly become distant or strict or cold, he would have noticed. He would have adjusted. People like him always do, so I stayed the same, polite, available. Predictable. What changed was everything he couldn't see. I stopped positioning my life around his convenience. I stopped assuming my needs would someday be his concern. I stopped waiting. Instead, I began building a future that didn't include expectations. I enrolled in a health plan I had delayed for years. Not the cheapest one, the practical one. I made arrangements I had always postponed because I thought family would handle them. I didn't feel sad doing this. I felt focused. There's a difference. Weeks passed, then months. My son remained unaware. He talked about promotions, vacations, expenses. He spoke freely, the way people do when they believe the foundation beneath them is permanent. One evening he mentioned something casually. "If anything ever happens to you, I'll handle the paperwork. Don't worry." That was when I knew he still believed responsibility was optional, that it only applied when convenient. That love meant access. I said nothing. I just nodded again, but inside I had already removed him from decisions he hadn't earned the right to make. Soon after, a small inconvenience hit him, not a crisis, not an emergency. Just life. He needed a document, a signature, something he assumed I would immediately provide. He called me 3 times that day. I didn't ignore him. I simply told him I would get to it later. For the first time, he had to wait. That bothered him more than I expected. The next time he needed advice, then support, then reassurance. Each time I was calm, available but not urgent, and slowly I saw confusion replace confidence. He wasn't used to delay. He wasn't used to boundaries. One day he asked me directly, "Is everything okay with you?" I looked at him and said the truth. "Yes, everything is finally okay." He didn't understand what I meant. But he felt it. People sense when the balance shifts, when control moves quietly. He started calling more often, checking in, asking questions, not out of care, out of uncertainty. Because when someone you assumed would always be there stops being predictable, you start to worry. And worry is the first step toward realization. The real shock was still coming. But by now, the ground beneath him was already unstable. He just didn't know how far the fall would be. And for the first time in his life, he was about to learn what independence actually costs. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, he told himself nothing was wrong. People always do when the ground starts shifting under their feet. Then came the phone calls with longer pauses. The questions disguised as concern, the sudden interest in my health. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening. "You sure everything's okay?" "Yes," I replied. "I told you that already." That answer didn't comfort him. Because comfort depends on predictability, and I was no longer predictable. A few weeks later, he mentioned money, not directly, casually, rising expenses, unexpected costs, the stress of responsibility. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then he said something familiar. "You know, as parents get older, kids naturally step in. That's how families work." I waited a moment before responding. "Some families," I said, "not all." There it was. The first crack. He laughed it off, but I could hear it, the discomfort. From that day on, his tone changed. He stopped assuming. He started asking, small things at first, then bigger ones. One afternoon, he asked me if I had made arrangements for my future care. "Yes," I said, "I've taken care of it." "With who?" he asked. "With professionals," I answered. That silence lasted longer than the others. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled, because he had always believed one thing without ever saying it out loud, that no matter what he said, no matter how distant he became, I would always be there as a backup plan. And now, that plan was disappearing. A few days later, he visited again. This time, he looked around the house more carefully, not with nostalgia, with calculation. He asked questions that weren't about me. What will happen to this place? Have you thought about selling? Who's helping you manage things? I answered calmly, briefly, enough to be honest, not enough to reassure. That night after he left, I sat alone and realized something important. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to hurt directly. Sometimes, the strongest response is removing yourself from someone's sense of entitlement. Because when someone realizes they are no longer central to your future, they feel it immediately. And it scares them. What he didn't know yet was that this fear was only the beginning. The real moment of truth was coming, not through words, but through a situation he could not escape. And when it arrived, he would finally understand the weight of the sentence he once typed so easily. The moment arrived quietly, no warning, no dramatic phone call, just a normal afternoon that turned heavy without asking permission. I was at home when my phone rang. This time, his voice wasn't casual, it was rushed, unsteady. "Dad, I need to talk to you." I listened. He explained that things weren't going well, work pressure, financial strain, a situation he hadn't planned for. For the first time in a long while, he sounded unsure. Then he said it. "I might need some help." I didn't answer immediately, not to punish him, not to teach a lesson, but because I wanted to be honest. "I can help," I said slowly, "but not the way you expect." That confused him. "I don't understand," he said. "I'm not your safety net," I replied. "I can support you as a father, not as an obligation." There was silence on the line, the kind that forces people to think instead of react. He tried again. "I didn't mean what I said before," he added quickly. "I was stressed." I believed him, but belief doesn't erase consequences. "I know," I said, "and I forgive you." That surprised him. "But forgiveness doesn't mean going back," I continued. "It means moving forward differently." He didn't argue. He couldn't, because for the first time he was standing on his own choices. A few days later, he came to see me. Not confident, not entitled, just honest. He admitted something he had never said before. "I thought you'd always be there, no matter what I said." I nodded. "I was," I said. "And that's where I went wrong." That sentence landed harder than any anger ever could. He looked at me differently after that, not as a backup plan, not as a burden, as a person, and that was the beginning of change, not because I demanded it, not because I threatened him, but because I stopped making love easy to misuse. That day, I didn't win anything. I didn't feel powerful. What I felt was peace, because for the first time, my future wasn't built on expectation. It was built on choice, and his next choice would decide whether this story ended with distance or with something rebuilt on respect. After that conversation, nothing changed immediately, and that was important. Real change doesn't announce itself. It shows up in behavior when no one is watching. He didn't suddenly become affectionate. He didn't apologize again. Instead, he became careful. Careful with his words, careful with his assumptions, careful with the way he spoke to me. For the first time, he asked instead of deciding. He asked how I was feeling. He asked if I needed anything. He asked before making plans that involved me. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One evening, he called just to talk. No problem to solve, no request hidden behind concern. We spoke about ordinary things, work, weather, life. Before hanging up, he hesitated. Then he said, "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you by assuming." I let the silence sit for a moment. "That pressure," I said, "came from love that never learned limits." He didn't interrupt. "I thought being a good father meant always being available," I continued. "But availability without boundaries teaches dependence, not respect." That was the first time I heard something change in his breathing. not guilt, understanding. Weeks passed, he stopped testing me, stopped checking how far he could lean. He started standing on his own again, and something unexpected happened. I missed him less, not because I loved him less, but because I no longer feared being alone. Independence does that. It removes desperation. One afternoon, he visited and helped around the house without being asked. No performance, no announcement. When he was about to leave, he said something quietly. "I don't want to be the kind of son who shows up only when it's convenient." I looked at him. "That's a decision," I said, "not a promise." He nodded. "I know." That was enough. Because growth doesn't need guarantees, it needs consistency. And consistency takes time. I didn't know then how this story would end, whether it would heal completely or remain careful. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next would not be built on fear. It would be built on clarity, and that made all the difference. Time has a way of testing change, not in big moments, but in small, inconvenient ones. A few months later, my health failed me briefly, nothing dramatic, nothing life-threatening, but enough to disrupt routine. A doctor's visit turned into tests. Tests turned into rest orders. I didn't call my son right away, not to hide it, but to see something. When he found out, his reaction was different this time. He didn't panic. He didn't take control. He asked, "What do you need from me?" That question mattered more than the help itself. I told him the truth. Just be available, not in charge. He showed up the next day, quietly, no speeches. He sat with me while I rested, handled small things, left when I asked him to, no guilt, no overcorrection, balance. Later, he admitted something. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that if I stepped in too much, you'd pull away again." I smiled. "That fear," I said, "means you're finally paying attention." We talked more openly after that, not emotionally, honestly, about aging, about independence, about responsibility that's chosen, not forced. He told me something I hadn't expected. "When I sent that message," he said, "I thought I was protecting my future." He paused. "I didn't realize I was rejecting my past." That was the closest thing to an apology I needed, because regret doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs awareness. As my strength returned, life settled into something quieter. Not perfect, but stable. I wasn't waiting anymore, and he wasn't running. We were standing separately, but facing the same direction. And that's when I understood something that took me a lifetime to learn. Children don't owe their parents their lives, but parents don't owe their children their future either. What they owe each other is honesty. And honesty, when it comes late, still has the power to change everything. Part 99. Something shifted after that. Not between us, inside me. For most of my life, I had carried a quiet fear. The fear of being irrelevant. The fear that once my usefulness ended, so would my place. That fear had shaped my parenting more than I ever admitted. It made me give too much. It made me stay silent when I should have spoken. It made me confuse love with sacrifice. Letting go of that fear felt like putting down a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. My son noticed the difference before I did. "You seem lighter," he said one afternoon. "More settled." I thought about it. "I'm not waiting anymore," I replied. "That's probably what you're seeing." He nodded slowly. That answer stayed with him, because when someone stops waiting, they stop being controllable. Weeks later, a conversation came up that once would have terrified me. He mentioned his own future, career moves, relocation, possibilities. In the past, I would have calculated how each choice affected me. This time, I didn't. "That's your life," I said. "You should build it honestly." He looked surprised. "You're not worried?" he asked. I shook my head. "I trust myself now," I said, "not circumstances." That sentence changed the tone of everything that followed. Because it removed pressure from both sides, he no longer felt responsible for my happiness, and I no longer tied my peace to his decisions. Freedom does that. It clarifies relationships. Later, he admitted something quietly. "When you stopped depending on me, I stopped feeling trapped. That was hard to hear, but it was true. Dependence often looks like love from one side and obligation from the other. Understanding that didn't make me bitter. It made me wiser. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was finally honest, not built on fear, not built on guilt, built on choice. And that's when I realized the real lesson of this story. Revenge isn't about taking something away. It's about reclaiming yourself. And when you do that, people around you are forced to meet you differently. The story wasn't over yet, but the ending was already taking shape, quietly. Over time, life settled into something steady, not dramatic, not perfect, but honest. My son didn't become ideal overnight, and I didn't become distant. What changed was the space between us. It was no longer filled with expectation. It was filled with choice. One evening, months later, he sat across from me and said something I never expected to hear. "I used to think independence meant not owing anyone anything," he said. "Now I realize it also means taking responsibility for what matters." I didn't respond right away, because sometimes the most powerful moments don't need correction. They need acknowledgement. "I'm glad you learned that on your own," I finally said. That was the moment I knew this story wasn't about punishment. It was about growth. I never threw his message back at him. I never reminded him of that sentence. I didn't need to. Because the consequence of that message had already done its work. It forced me to rebuild myself, and it forced him to confront himself. Years later, when people ask me if I regret the way things happened, I answer honestly, no. Because comfort without respect is fragile, and love without boundaries teaches the wrong lessons. I didn't lose a son, I gained dignity. And through that, I gained a relationship that didn't depend on fear. If you're a parent listening to this, remember something important. Your job is not to make yourself indispensable. Your job is to raise someone who can stand without leaning on you. And if you're a son or a daughter hearing this, remember that independence doesn't mean abandonment. It means choosing care, not avoiding it. That one message my son sent changed everything, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed the truth we were both avoiding. Sometimes the hardest lessons arrive quietly, in a single sentence, typed without thought. But what you do after that sentence is what defines the rest of the story. Thank you for listening. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see your own life differently, stay with us. Subscribe for more real stories about family, choices, and the moments that shape us. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Because someone else might need to hear it today.